So, yep, welcome everybody to the Vermont Vegetable and Berry Growers Association winter webinar series. Today, we're going to be talking about diversified farm crop pollination and common pollinators. And we're going to start off with Spencer Hardy from the Vermont Center for Ecostudies and the farm Upstream, and then I'll follow up. And I'm Laura Johnson, the pollinator support specialist with UVM Extension. And I guess, Spencer, are you ready to get
ready? Yeah.
We can just get started.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Welcome. Hi. I work for the Vermont Center for Ecostudies doing native bee inventories, surveying, monitoring throughout the state. And on the side, I work with Jake and a couple others on the farm Upstream. Jake presented last week about our wholesale squash operation. We also grow ground cherries for wholesale outlets, which will make maybe a little more sense further on in this presentation. Quick game just to warm people up, test their bee identification skills. Most people think they know what a bee is. I still have trouble sometimes. Some of these trickier ones, like this one, it's not a bee. This is a fly that mimics bees. Some of the bees don't really look like the stereotypical bee that you get on the emojis or on cereal boxes. But some of the ones that do aren't bees. This is a fun one. This is a mock orange associated bee. Looks like an ant to me. And then much of the year, bees are basically maggots in their nest until they pupate and become the adults that we are familiar with and that we'll talk about here. Why does it matter if it's a bee or not? Sometimes it doesn't, sometimes it does. Bees get a lot of credit for pollination, and in part that is because they have these really specialized branched hairs. Sort of imagine a split end on their body somewhere, depending on the species. They're on different parts of the body. But these are a specific adaptation to collecting pollen grains from flowers. Other wasps and flower visiting insects don't have these, so they're not as efficient at collecting pollen grains. And then this video is a honeybee working an almond flower. And you can see the individual pollen grains sticking to these hairs and then getting rubbed onto the anther of the almond, and that's where you get pollination, which leads to fruit set. Obviously very important for commercial growers. You can just see that a couple times that you can see individual grains getting stuck. She's trying to get to nectar at the base of the flower, but in doing so touches these anthers or the stigma that have the pollen grains and carries them off to the next flower, where she likely bumps into the anther and causes pollination. Laura will talk more about the flower part of things in the second half. And so Vermont has over 350 different species of bees. This is something that we've been working on for the last few years, trying to figure out what's here, what species we're concerned about in terms of conservation and potential population declines. We know some information about declines of bumblebees that have made some press in the last few years and gotten people worried about a general decline in pollinators and the potential impacts on the food system, pollination services. But Vermont has a lot of bees. They're pretty diverse. A lot of them nest above ground. A lot of them are parasites, which I won't talk about a ton, but they're like cowbirds and they take over the nest of other bees. And the vast majority are solitary, unlike the honeybee that we're all familiar with. I will talk a little bit about the honeybee, but I'll leave this up to future talks from others who spend a lot more time with honeybees. Honeybees are a European species that has only been in North America since like 1600s. And in Vermont basically only exists in domesticated hives in people's backyards, on farms, in apiaries. And we worry a lot. There's a lot of concern in the media about the decline of honeybees, which is coming from some real phenomenon that beekeepers have noticed, but in terms of the disappearance of honeybees, it's a little misleading. This USDA figure shows the number of honeybee hives has actually increased in the last few decades. And because it's an agricultural animal, humans are very good at making more honeybees. But these two hexagons, here show the yield of individual colonies has declined over time, suggesting there's increased stress on these honeybee hives, lower survival, lower output, and which makes it harder for beekeepers to do their job and to provide an abundance of bees on farms for pollination. A lot of this is due to this mite here, the Varroa mite, but there's a number of other causes that aren't totally well understood, but a lot of people working on this. I have not spent a lot of time studying honeybees, so I will defer to others, but I will just note that there is plenty of evidence showing negative impacts of honeybees on native pollinator species, especially other bees. There's a lot of diseases that are spilling over from honeybees into wild bees. And then every once in a while, you see evidence like this photo series of a honeybee actually stealing pollen from the leg of a native bumblebee. I don't think this happens very often, but it's something to be concerned about, especially from a wild bee conservation standpoint in landscapes that are with high densities of honeybees. And this is map showing the estimated location of all of the honeybee hives, indicating that the vast majority of the state, especially all of the arable lands, are within the foraging distance of a known registered honeybee hive. So there's probably honeybees just about everywhere that people are growing vegetables and fruit commercially, even if they're not coming from your operation. And then I'll just talk about a few of the different native bee genera that you might encounter on your farm and are certainly providing pollination services somewhere in the state. Bumblebees are the best example, probably the most well-known, and occur throughout the state. They're active all summer from early spring through the end of the last goldenrods and asters in October. This is one of the common species that actually inside of a greenhouse. I'm sure it's a wild bee, but it's trying to find pepper flowers on the links. They, for some crops and some circumstances, they're much better pollinators than honeybees. And they probably do the majority of the native bee pollination services, although there's exceptions to that we'll talk about a little bit. And I will note that you can buy honeybees or bumblebees for greenhouse pollination, for blueberries or other crops where you're concerned about pollination. And it's better regulated now, but they were first available in the late 90s, I believe. There were some issues with pathogen spillover from these commercial hives that had nasty gut parasites that escaped into wild populations. So it's something to be concerned about, something to keep an eye on if you are thinking about bringing bumblebees onto your farm. I wouldn't say don't do it, but do your research and make sure that there's a need for it. And I know there's a talk coming up in one of these future series about bumblebee. And again, I'll leave this to people that know more, but just something to be aware of. And Vermont has like 12 species of bumblebees currently. We've had more in the past. We've lost a couple. But any one of these species could be a valuable crop pollinator on your farm, depending on the specifics. Here's one on tomatillo. Here's one, a rarer bumblebee on a rare wildflower. But this bee also shows up on plenty of domesticated crops. And we have this, if you're interested in identifying the specific bumblebee species, we have this handy printout available on our website, Vermont Center for Ecostudies. Actually, it's Vermont Atlas of Life / bees or bumblebees. I think if you Google bumblebees of Vermont or New England, you'll find it pretty easily. But many of them are identifiable to species with a little bit of practice. Probably not particularly relevant to crop pollination, but it can be a fun exercise, especially when you see these red ones that are fairly distinctive. That's this one here. Maybe the second most important native bee genera for commercial crop pollination are these mining bees, the Andrena. They are mostly active in the spring, and many of them specialize on only a small number of flowers. There's a lot of them that specialize on native plants, willows and trout lilies, and a wide variety of wild native plants that have these specialist bees that only visit that plant for all of their needs for the whole season. And so they're only flying for a month or two out of the year for any one species. And there are some species that are specialized on crops that are really only visiting that crop. So this picture is a strawberry. That's the mini miner. It's quite small. Really only visits strawberries and maybe a couple related wildflowers, cinquefoils. Probably shows up on commercial strawberries. I've seen it mostly on wild plants, but I'm sure there's examples of it on wild or cultivated strawberries. There's specialists on blueberries in this genus. And there's a lot that sort of prefer rose family plants, apples and brambles. I wouldn't call them specialists though, but they're visiting a lot of the early mid-spring flowering trees, shrubs, crops that people are growing. These are all nesting in the ground, and I'll talk a little bit about that for some of these other genera, because that can be important for thinking about managing for these native pollinators on farms. Bumblebees nesting often in the ground, but in old rodent burrows or in thatch under a old brush pile, every once in a while in a rotten tree stump. But they really seem to like nesting where there's been rodent activity in the past. Mason bees, you may have heard of these, the blue orchard bees, the sort of the flagship species that people are cultivating for pollination of apples, other tree fruit, because they fly really early in the spring before some of these other species get going. There's a species that specializes only on blueberry flowers. There's some that really like brambles. There's some that I've seen on strawberries. They're solitary cavity nesting species. So these are the ones that nest in bee hotels, in above ground nest sites. And also commercially available. You can buy bee hotels that are pre-populated with larvae, and you bring them out in the spring. They wake up and you've got these young bees that are able to pollinate your crops. Again, I'd be really careful about this. I wouldn't recommend it at the moment because it's pretty new and there's a lot of uncertainty about disease spread. And I'm not convinced that they are as effective as the dealers think they are, and that they may not stay on your farm. They may just take off and disappear. I think the reestablishment rate is really low. So you're probably better off providing nesting habitat for existing mason bees and other species on your farm. And if people want to talk more about this after, I'm happy to stick around and chat. Or if people have questions or concerns or comments about any of these commercial available species, I'm happy to share my thoughts more at the end. Sweat bees, this is a really diverse family. These are mostly ground nesting. A few of them nest in rotten logs. They visit any number of crops. They're active all summer. See a lot of them on tomatoes, but they're on blueberries. They're on apples. There's one that specializes in tomatillos and ground cherries. Carpenter bees, another really common generalist species. These are small blue bees that nest in hollow stems, especially they really like raspberry stems. They hollow out the pith, and that's where they lay their eggs. But they're in sunflowers and goldenrods and mints and sumac, anything where they can chew out a nice cavity for themselves. And they're active all season, basically anywhere in Vermont where you have shrubby vegetation that's left. And then there's obviously hundreds of more species of bees that I didn't talk about. There's flies, there's moths, there's butterflies that are doing a lot of crop pollination and are not getting necessarily noticed. Yeah, some of these are on cucumbers. This is a tomatillo flower, another tomatillo flower, blackberry. So I'll talk about this one in a second. So obviously there's a lot of, with 350 species, it's kind of overwhelming to know and to understand what species you have on your farm and what you can do for them. So Laura and I and a few others have formed this Vermont Pollinator Working Group. We have a grant from UVM to create this Know Your Five campaign that we're calling it. Basically, identify the top 5 pollinating groups for each crop, and synthesize what we know about their flight periods, their nesting needs, basically what farmers can do to support them and to be able to recognize them so that growers are better able to assess the pollination that's happening on their crops. We're going to make these some PDFs, some more online resources, and see where it goes with that. We're just in the early stages of this. We'll hopefully have some outputs to share this spring before these bees wake up. And as an example, these are the 5, probably the 5 most common squash pollinators. And Laura will talk a little bit more about squash pollination in the second half, but this is the squash bee. It's a specialist on winter squash pumpkins. It only visits the large flowered cucurbits. Doesn't really have any interest in cucumbers. The rest of these are more generalist species that also visit squash and do a fair amount of squash pollination. This striped one in the corner, this is the squash longhorn cuckoo bee. So it is a parasitic species that takes over the nest of a squash bee and lays its egg inside the squash bee nest. And then that larva develops and eats the pollen that the squash bee had made in the nest. Not necessarily a great thing if you're a squash bee, but if you're a squash farmer, this is a good indication that you have a healthy abundance of squash bees. And I wouldn't be concerned about it reducing squash bee populations in any meaningful way. There's a lot, I find them on big squash farms and on some community gardens where there's a lot of squash being grown and the squash bees are thriving. And then you get this sketch shows up. It's really distinctive. This anchor shaped mark on the middle segment. And yeah, it's a fun, uncommon bee that is most common on big farms. And then this black one is the 2-spotted longhorn bee, primarily in the Champlain Valley, Chittenden County, but often visits squash and other crops, including corn, cucumbers, and the honeybee. This is the one that we're all familiar with. Is a fairly common visitor of squash flowers, and then the bumblebees, one of the more important squash pollinators. And I'll let Laura talk more about that in a second. So some general thoughts on how to increase native and wild pollinators on farm landscapes. I think because Vermont agriculture is such a small scale compared to the rest of the country, we stand a chance of being able to do most of our pollination with wild bees, maybe with some exceptions of larger apple farms or blueberry farms. But for the most part, we've got a diversity of wild bees. Populations, as far as we can tell, seem fairly healthy for most species. There's a lot of annual variation, but there's also a lot that growers can do on a really small scale that I think can be beneficial for both native bees and for crop pollination services. Wildflower strips, pollinator strips are all the rage right now. And I also would recommend people that are interested go explore growing like a native hedgerow as opposed to just an annual wildflower strip. Some of these especially things like willows that bloom really early in the season. It's hard. There's not a lot of annual flowers that can be grown that flower in early April or May. And this can be a limiting time for pollen resources for wild bees. So things like willows that are fairly easy to grow and bloom really early are a great way to provide an early food source that attracts bees to the area, and create a healthy population that's then there and available for pollination a few months later for row crops or trees or fruit. So willows, dogwoods, sumacs, and then meadowsweet. Spirea is the other name for the genus. If you had all of those, I think you'd cover most of the growing season, which would keep the bees around and provide flower resources when there's like in the gaps between blooming crops, and help keep and support and grow a population of wild bumblebees and other crop pollinators. And also these shrubby hedgerows and strips provide nesting habitat for a lot of these species that's undisturbed from tillage or from mowing or other disturbance that might reduce nesting survival. But that's probably equally limiting to bee diversity and density on farms is the lack of resources over the whole growing season and lack of nesting habitat that's relatively undisturbed. You can use these bee hotels. Success seems to vary, and I can't totally figure out why. Some sites they get occupied really quickly, other sites they get ignored. And there's also concern about disease and pathogen buildup if you leave them out for too many years in a row. So smaller, short-lived ones that decompose after a couple of seasons are probably better for limiting fungal and other mites and pathogens that get attracted to these large nesting aggregations. And maybe easier than that, though, is just to leave some unmowed strips or some raspberry canes where these small bees can nest in the natural pith. And then a lot of these ground nesting species also really like sandy, bare soil. So if you had a steep bank that you couldn't grow anything on, or a sand pile or something, you're likely to have a lot of ground nesting species in there that are great to keep around for crop pollination. And then maybe not terribly important for organic fruit and veg growers, but there is plenty of concern with pesticides. Systemic insecticides like neonicotinoids have been shown to have both lethal and sublethal effects on bees in a variety of situations. And just, I mean, be cognizant of that if in your spray selections and seed treatments, if you're using any seed treatments, these systemic insecticides get inside the seeds, and then they're in the flowers, they're in the pollen, and they end up in the bees' diet and nests and larvae. And then avoiding spraying while the bees are active if you can. So late evening, I think, is the recommendation. But again, this is a little bit the edge of my area of expertise. Others can talk more about this better than I can. I guess we've covered this. And now I'll let Laura talk about things a little more from the crop side of things. How do I stop my share?
Okay, and yeah, thank you, Spencer. We can just pause too. There were some questions in the chat that we can look at. One from Lorna, or a comment, normally I've never had problem with bumblebees, but I was harvesting in the garden and one was buzzing at my feet. I didn't pay much attention, but it continued to be there and started toward my face. I backed away and it chased me. What do you think about that, Spencer?
They can be aggressive, but usually only when they're defending a nest site. I've very rarely been stung by bumblebees, usually when it's because I grabbed them in the net by accident or something. But if there's a nest site and if you're disturbing it, pulling up weeds or something, they may come after you. Often you can just give that nest site a couple meter berth and should be good to go for the rest of the season.
Cool. And then Jack asked, do you have recommendations of where to purchase bumblebees if someone is thinking about using commercial bees?
I think there's a webinar in a couple weeks about it.
Yeah, I can comment a little bit on that. So my understanding is a lot of folks are buying from BioBest. I'm not going to make any, recommendations, favoring one company or another. And I think BioBest distributes the covert hives. One thing I'll just mention, regardless of where you are buying bumblebees from, is that there are different species of bumblebees for sale if you're looking online, and there's some that are native to the western part of the country and some that are native to our part of the country. So just being sure that you're ordering a European, no, what is it? I
think the common eastern one is the only one.
The common eastern, sorry, the common eastern bumblebee. So just being mindful of that, but that's my comment on purchasing bumblebees. I think there are other companies that you can buy from, but I don't have them on the tip of my tongue right now. If anybody else has suggestions, please feel free to chime in. Another
suggestion along the same lines of limiting interaction with wild bees would be these queen excluders that keep, I think it's just a little plastic device. I can't actually picture one, but they're supposed to keep wild bees, queens, from going back into the nest, because sometimes they'll try and take over the nest, and then they either get killed by the bees in there, or they potentially pick up diseases. So I would definitely recommend one of those if possible.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that. It was, some research just came out about wild bees getting trapped in the commercial bee boxes, and several wild queens dying in that way. Some research out of Cornell that's starting to look at that. So yeah, having a queen excluder, and I think you might have to request it when you order your bumblebee colonies, is something to think about as well. Okay, thank you, Vern. Vern posted some sources for bumblebees from Maine, and then there's also another. Vern asked a question, Spencer, what's the approximate minimum size of a sandy area or sand pile that is useful to provide habitat to ground nesting bees? Can it be small?
Yeah, I just answered it in the chat too, but
sorry.
no, I can talk about it a little more, because I'm not totally sure, and I've had this question before, and I'd love to see people experiment and see what happens. But yeah, a bare patch where there wasn't a lot of vegetation or thick grass. If you're on a generally sandier or looser soil, a square meter where there wasn't a lot of vegetation could have hundreds of bees nesting in it. In terms of bringing in a dump truck load of sand, it probably would be effective. But I don't know if a garden cart load would make a big difference. Some of these species have been known to nest 3 feet down into the soil. Yeah, bees that make whirlpools in the soil. Not totally sure what you mean there. There are some that early spring, you'll see these, they look like anthills basically. And a sandy area like a ball field or someplace with sparse vegetation, you get these hundreds of anthills will appear overnight in late April, early May. And that's the unequal cellophane bee usually. It's a spring generalist, maybe visiting some crops. But a lot of the other ones, the nests are very similar to anthills.
Cool. I also just mentioned that Brian had requested the link to the bumblebee chart, and thanks, Fern. He posted it in the chat. So if folks are interested in that, you can click the link and print that out. Also, Brian says a load of bank run sand will do it. They don't need a screened product, which is more expensive, which he found out by accident. Thank you for sharing that. Okay. I think unless we have any other questions, I might move on to.
I'll try and keep an eye on the chat and can answer.
Okay,
them as they
cool.
come.
Yeah. What are the other pollinators while I'm figuring this out that we might have out in our crops? Spencer just gave us a lot of detail on bees as pollinators, but then we're going to have, a lot of other types of insects that are out there, and you can just put it in the chat. And, what are other people's ideas for who might be pollinating in our crops? There's 7, including bees, that are considered pollinators. Hummingbirds, moths. Anything else? There we go. Flies, butterflies, wasps. So those are most of them. Moths, bees, beetles are the only one I think that we're missing on that list there. So there's a whole bunch of different pollinators, and bats are also pollinating animals, but not that I know of in crops, at least in our region. So like I mentioned, I'm going to be talking a little bit more about the plant side of pollination. And this is a chart that's looking mostly at kind of the gamut of plant pollination, from wind pollination to insect-mediated pollination, and those crops that we might sell that don't need pollination to be marketable, like lettuce and spinach. And we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about some of these things as we move forward, but this is kind of the bird's eye view of insect pollinator dependent crops, and especially those middle two columns like pumpkins and blueberries and tomatoes. So what is pollen? And it's really this, the reproductive, it serves as a reproductive function, and it contains the male gamete to fertilize the female ovule in a flower. So it's basically the male, the flower sperm that's going to pollinate the female part of the flower in order to produce fruit and seed. And this picture here is just showing the wide diversity of pollen that we might find in plants. And some of these pollen examples are from crops that we grow, like we have squash pollen here, and strawberry pollen, and we also have some pollens representing other flowers and weeds in our fields. But you can see they're all different in shape, and the shape of pollen is really related to its method, to a flower's method of reproduction. So if it's pollen that is required to be moved by insects, for example, it's going to be barbed or really sticky in some way so that it can be easily picked up and transferred. Other types of pollen grains that may not require insect-mediated pollination, like corn, tends to be smoother and more lightweight, so it can be transported by wind, for example. And I just wanted to mention that regardless of the type of pollen, like whether it's meant for or designed in a way that it is transported well by insects, insects can also feed on, like bees can also feed on pollen, like corn pollen, and it does provide a food source to them as well. So what is pollination and fertilization, just kind of a quick review so we're all on the same page on some basic biology here. But pollination is the transfer of pollen from the male anther to the female stigma, which I don't know if you can see my arrow, but if we're looking at plant A and plant B, B is showing pollen coming off of an anther and then being deposited on the stigma of the flower, which is the female part. So when the pollen sticks to this part of the flower, it starts to grow a pollen tube. So it grows this tube down the style here. This yellow bit is representing that. And then it fertilizes the egg in the flower. And there's a lot of different things that can impact pollination, namely ambient conditions. You know, if it's too hot, pollen can degrade. If it's really dry, it can dehydrate. If it's cold, pollen can become immobilized. Rain can wash it away. And, you know, rain can also limit insect activity and also pollen release from anthers. So generally, though speaking, with the successful release of pollen, generally the sooner pollination can occur in a flower, the more likelihood that you're going to get your fruit set. I wanted to highlight today this kind of gradient of dependency on insect pollination by crops in our fields. And so there's differences among crops and how much they rely on insects for pollination. And this gradient, generally, I've just kind of labeled it as, you know, high from like maybe not needing much or any insect pollination to high need of insect pollination. And the highest need, that the types of plants or flowers that have the highest need for pollination by insects are imperfect flowers. So imperfect flowers, which are on the far right of the slide here, this squash flower here, are flowers that are either male or female. They don't have both reproductive parts in the flower. Whereas perfect flowers, which is shown in this drawing on the left, are housing both male and female reproductive parts. So the pistil being the female and the stamen being the male part. So, and those perfect flowers can really have quite a range in terms of their dependency on insect pollination, even though they're all contained in one flower. Whoops, sorry about that. So many crops with perfect flowers still need insect pollination to optimize fruit quality and yield. And this picture is just looking at an example of that with blueberries, where, you know, blueberry flower, and I'll touch on this a little bit more later, is a perfect flower in that it contains both male and female parts, but without insect-mediated pollination to help encourage the release and deposition of pollen, there is a clear reduction in fruit maturation, fruit size, and just overall yield on your plants. So I'd like to cover some common flowering field crops and their pollination needs, thinking about this gradient from kind of low to high, but I'm actually going to start from that high end. And Spencer mentioned winter squash and pumpkin flower pollination and the know your 5 concept of like knowing the top 5 bees or pollinators depending on the crop. And so I just wanted to start by highlighting the pollination in squash and sort of generally in cucurbits like cucumbers and melons. So as I mentioned before, with winter squash and pumpkins, those big belled flowers, we have separate male and female flowers. And these flowers are only open for a short time of the day. They'll often open pre-dawn. and then remain open for a few hours. The length at which they remain open really depends on weather and temperature. I've noticed, and you all may have noticed as well, that flowers tend to close sooner when it's hot. And when conditions are more favorable, they tend to stay open a little bit longer. And then once they close, they remain closed, and that's it for that flower. Male flowers, there's definitely more male flowers than female flowers, and that can also be impacted by weather conditions and drought. Drought in particular can cause squash plants to produce much more male flowers. Oh, and I just wanted to mention that Spencer mentioned one of the Know Your Five bees for squash production that are, really making it all happen in your fields are the squash bees, and they specialize on these big belled flowers. And if you know that you have a squash population in your fields, you can go out if you're out there at dusk, you can peek inside closed flowers and you'll probably see some of the male squash bees hanging out in there, which is pretty cool. And it's pretty fun to find them there. The females go into the soil to nest overnight. So the pollen in the winter squash and fertilization and pollen, or the receptivity of pollen for squash production, is really just that day that the flower is open, and the viability of pollen in squashes is highest early in the morning, even though the flowers are open longer. And each fruit needs about 2,000 grains of pollen to be deposited on the stigma for successful fruit production. And but an anther will produce up to 43,000 pollen grains. So comparatively, it's not that many, but it definitely requires a fair amount of activity in your fields for that pollen deposition to occur. And more pollen has been found to improve retention of fruit set on your plants. And this calendar here is just kind of highlighting, when flowering in your squashes and pumpkins, winter squashes and pumpkins is, at peak, kind of that mid-July, early July through August. And that is also correlated with the activity of squash bees. And sorry, go back. And this is also just looking at specifically squash bees and their phenology and distribution around the state. And you can see here again the population of squash bees really peaking right around July, and then kind of decreasing as the late summer fall goes on. So really you can be on the lookout for them in your fields, and there tends to be more males and females, at least based on this data. Pollen of squash is pretty heavy, and it's also very sticky. This is a bee. I was walking through a field this summer, and this bee landed on me early in the morning. You could just see how much pollen was stuck on her as she moved across my sweatshirt there. And so it's really heavy and sticky, and since it's heavy, it doesn't move very well in the wind. And that bee, being a bumblebee, and other types of bees are variable in how much pollen they pick up when they're visiting flowers. And this image I got from a really nice publication from Penn State University, and it's just kind of comparing the efficacy of 3 types of bees in squash pollination. So we've got squash bees, bumblebees, and honeybees. And squash bees and honeybees kind of have similar rates of pollen acquisition and deposition on male and female flowers, and bumblebees are very efficient at picking up pollen, as you saw in that previous picture where it was just totally loaded. Bumblebees are particularly hairy, and so they pick up pollen really well with all the hairs on their bodies. And also, I just wanted to mention there is a bit of a conversation around a competition between bees, and in particular thinking about managed bees and bringing in managed bees like honeybees that might be out competing wild bees. And I do think that is something to be aware of, but I also just observationally have noticed that there are points in the season when you maybe have transplanted squashes and they're a little more advanced than they might otherwise be if they're coming from a direct seeded planting, and they might be flowering before squash bees have already emerged. So honeybees, I think, can play a role along with other wild bees like bumblebees in these sort of shoulder seasons when squash bees phenologically may not have emerged yet. So, but also just even during peak season, squash bees might be more foraging in the morning and honeybees in the afternoon, just because honeybees are a little bit more delicate when it comes to weather conditions, and they really only want to be in those ideal weather conditions. So I think there's a balance to be found there among bees. And then I just wanted to highlight the time of day and variability in pollen acquisition. Pollen tends to be most viable and in the morning, and pollination is probably going to be more likely in the morning. And this is showing, based on some honeybee research, the number of pollen grains collected in the morning as compared to early morning as compared to late morning, and how that changes over time. And a lot of that might have to do with there's just more pollen readily available on the anther first thing in the morning, and it hasn't received the insect visits that it has by mid-morning or the end of the morning there. So it also might be stickier in the morning as compared to later in the day when it is dried out a little bit. So that was just a conversation about imperfect flowers. So those flowers that are either female or male. And now I just want to go through a little bit. Let me just look at my time. Perfect flowers that are more highly dependent on insect pollination, and then move towards those that are not so dependent on insect pollination. But I'm not going to go through all of these, but just to highlight some, blueberries, apples, plums, cherries, and brambles are perfect flowers and crops that are pretty highly dependent on bee pollination. And just to look at an example, looking at blueberries, we have, both male and female parts within a single flower, identified here: the stamen, the male reproductive parts, and the pistil and the stigma, the female reproductive parts. The stamen is kind of enclosed by the flower, and the pistil extends a little bit. And the stamen with the anthers at the end and the pollen pores in blueberries in particular are pollen is most effectively released when it receives pollination from something like a buzz pollinator. And the most commonly known is a bumblebee, and Spencer mentioned another type of bee, the mining bees, also are buzz pollinators that really play a big role in effective blueberry pollination. So pollination in blueberries should occur within, the first 3 days of flower opening, and, beyond 6 days, probably not going to get much in terms of pollination. And all of that can vary depending on weather conditions and heat. And, if it's really hot, then that period of pollination can decrease to a day. So And and just in terms of efficacy of different bees, again, having different efficacies. Honeybees can pollinate blueberries, and out in the Midwest, Michigan, out west in Oregon, they use honeybees for pollination and blueberries, but they don't perform that buzz pollination, so just aren't as effective, but are just in such numbers that they can help with blueberry pollination at a much larger scale than we see here in Vermont. So other perfect flowers with moderate dependencies. I'm just going to highlight strawberries. I think this is a good example. Strawberries are an aggregate flower with the pistils in the center and the female parts in the stamen and the male parts around the outside of those pistils. And strawberries, most commercial varieties are self-fertile, and so they can pollinate themselves and can be pollinated by wind and are enhanced by pollination with insects, but aren't totally dependent on it like blueberries or apples might be. What happens is when as the stamens and the anthers start to dry down, they'll burst under pressure, and that bursting of pollen will disperse grains across the flower, which permits pollination and fertilization. And as insects like this lady beetle here walk across the flower, that can further help with full pollination of a berry. And you can just see in the bottom left of the slide here some well-pollinated berries versus not so well-pollinated berries. And then perfect flowers with lower and low dependency. Tomatoes, pepper, eggplants, other solanaceous crops. Tomatoes being, low dependency, but definitely benefiting. They also really benefit from buzz pollination, where this looking at this drawing here, this like cone of stamens with around enclosing the pistil of the flower. Those the male reproductive parts, when receiving buzz pollination from something like a bumblebee, it really helps to release pollen from those flowers. But as many of you likely know, just any sort of like, if they're on, if you have them strung up, like knocking those strings and vibrating plants and flowers that way can also do the job. You don't necessarily need the bees, but they definitely do help. And wind also can help release the pollen at the end of those anthers. Pollination should occur within 2 days of flower opening, but they can be receptive for as much as 8 days. And of course, pollination period and duration of flowering depends on if you've got determinate or indeterminate varieties planted. And then finally, I'm just going to highlight kind of on the low end of this spectrum of insect pollination dependency, peppers. So peppers don't necessarily need insect pollination. Their male reproductive parts will emit pollen just, without any prompting, but with the encouragement of, air movement or insects that can enhance the release of pollen, but it is not necessary. I also wanted to mention in solanaceous crops, they're not particularly attractive to some bees, in particular like managed bees like honeybees, because they are not great nectar producers, and honeybees are really nectar driven, whereas other types of wild bees do need nectar, but they're not collecting it in the way that honeybees do. So and they're really relying on pollen for, wild bees are really relying on pollen for reproduction and feeding their young. So that's just something to note about attractivity in solanaceous crops and bee activity on those flowers. So I think that's all I've got. If anybody has any questions. So let's see, looking in the chat, I see questions. Does rain completely prevent pollination from happening? And is there data on this? I think it probably depends on the flower type and also the strength of the rain. I would have to look at, at what kind of research is out there and what might determine failed or successful pollination from weather events. But it also is just, some bees don't mind being out in a light rain, like bumblebees. Honeybees are not going to really go out in that kind of condition. But so a lot of wild bees are going to brave the elements, I guess, and still go out to forage, whether that be in your crops or in the environment. So I think there's a lot of factors there to consider. And then somebody else messaged about saffron. I don't know much about saffron pollination. My understanding is that you collect the stamen or I'm not sure. I'm not really sure about saffron. I'd have to look that up, but I don't believe that if you're growing saffron for the spice, you don't need pollination services or stigmas. Comment on how much insect pollination is needed, and what would be good to keep in mind for when to remove row covers. Oh, okay, yeah. So if you're using row covers in, to exclude pests, once you start to have flowering, you do want to remove those row covers to ensure pollination. And make sure that bees can get in there. I have seen some research where folks experimenting with putting bumblebees under row covers. I don't know how efficient that would be or how effective it is, but I have seen some folks looking at that. I do know it's 1 o'clock, so I want to be respectful of people's time, and I will hang out. But I'm going to just stop the recording for now and just thank everybody for being here. And this will be posted on the Vermont Vegetable and Berry Growers Association YouTube page for viewing later. So thanks to those of you who might be watching this later.